Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Hi. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Drew Purves. He's the head of the Computational Ecology and Environmental Science Lab at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, UK. And a little bit of his background, he studied ecology in Cambridge and went on to get his PhD in ecological modeling at University of York, correct? I wasn't sure about that one. And after that, he was for 6 years a postdoc fellow at EEB in the department in Princeton. And besides his many publications in very important journals and supervision, he also lectures at Cambridge University. And he acts as a treasurer of the British Ecological Society, which I learned just turned 100 years, right? The British Ecological Society, not Drew,
Yeah,
clearly. Okay, so he's talking to us about the very exciting field of computational ecology. Thank you, Drew.
All right, hi everyone. I know some people were probably here yesterday. We had an afternoon I took an afternoon tutorial yesterday. So for those of you that have come back, thanks again for sticking with it. Hopefully there won't be too much. There will be some, but hopefully not too much overlap between what I'm going to say in the next hour and what we did yesterday afternoon. However, this is one of the areas where it will overlap a little bit. I just want to show you the web page for our group. Here it is. And I think actually I need to zoom in a bit like I did yesterday as well. So we have this strange group, I suppose, it's called the Computational Ecology and Environmental Science Group. And we are all people with backgrounds in ecology, and yet here we are within Microsoft Research in Cambridge, surrounded mostly by computer scientists. And so that's not something I ever expected. It was a big surprise to me that Microsoft started that group, and I joined when I saw that they were advertising for people to join. But the work we do has, as the name suggests, this computational flavor, and in particular, we're interested in trying to make quantitative predictions about various aspects of the natural environment. And as I'm sure you'll appreciate, that's not an easy thing to do. The natural environment is very complex, and it's not very well understood. It can be very hard to do experiments and very difficult to get the data. Sometimes I joke a little bit saying that the reason physics has been so successful is it's because in explaining the world is because it's created little worlds that it can predict. So you create a pendulum and you put it in a room with no airflow and et cetera, and then you go, hey presto, I can explain it, which of course is very impressive. But we don't have that luxury. We actually have to look at the real hot, nasty, difficult world out there of trees and animals and the oceans and the atmosphere and all the rest. And so traditional ecology has not really been able to, and you could even say is perhaps often not tried to make quantitative predictions. It's typically split into 3 different camps, if you like. There's pure theoretical ecology. So there are lots where we'd have equations that represent how we think the world might work, and we analyze those equations to get some insight into how things might work in reality. But those traditionally, that wouldn't have any connection with data. We'd have, and then 2 forms of empirical ecology, one out in the field. We can think of kind of like natural history, but obviously more sophisticated than that. And then finally, there would be controlled experiments, maybe in a greenhouse, so you create a little bit of ecology to study. And it's been fantastic, and as we just heard, the British Ecological Society has just turned 100 years, and we could look at all kinds of interesting findings about nature that those 3 approaches gave us. But what they haven't given us is what the world is now asking for, which is these quantitative predictions about how various aspects of ecosystems might change in the future in response to things like climate change, land use change, altered CO2 concentrations, invasive species, pollution, overharvesting, the list goes on, and of course combinations of all of those. So that's where our group comes in. We try to build those sorts of models. There are, of course, other groups around the world that do that, but in addition, we have a second part of our mission, which is to try to develop software to enable a much broader range of ecologists and other scientists to become involved in this kind of predictive modeling and to share the results of those models with decision makers. So that's the group. I wanted to show you some example projects. So here's one, for example. This is my scientific focus before I joined Microsoft was mostly about trees and forests, and in particular trying to model how the structure and species composition of forests emerges from the biology and interactions among individual trees. So the individual trees grow and die and reproduce and compete with each other for light and overtop each other, and somehow what emerges, bubbles up out of all of that is the variation in forests across the world that we see. And the forests in this region in Brazil look very different to the forests in Britain, for example. So here's some example modeling we've done where we've taken about 1.5 million or so data points. These are individual trees that have been monitored, so we know how they're growing, whether they died, and so on. And these maps are showing and then we've put this through the kind of Bayesian type modeling that we do a lot of, and you'll hear a bit about that in a minute, to generate these maps. So this one here is showing northern temperate hardwoods. So we've aggregated several species together, and this is how their growth rate varies across the eastern US. This is the mortality, and this is the recruitment. And this is the same thing plotted in climate space. And we can look at different species like southern temperate conifers or boreal hardwoods. And then what happens is we can then do simulations where we spread all of the trees equally and at low density and very small all over the whole country and let them fight it out. And we see what happens. And on the right-hand side here, you can see if we look at northern temperate hardwoods, this is the real pattern of northern temperate hardwoods. And on the left, we'll see what the model predicts. And so as they fight it out, this particular group starts to lose in the south, and it does fairly well in the north. And you can see that, and then it eventually starts to lose out in the north and ends up adopting a mid-latitude range, which is what we see. Now, it's not perfect. The model hasn't been fit to this data. This is an independent test, so that's pretty good. And we can look at other groups too, like here's the northern conifers, for example. As we go forward, we can see that they end up adopting a northern range, like we see in reality, and so on. So that's some work that my postdoc, Mark Vandervelde, he's moved on now, he's at the University of Florida, did. But for me, that was almost like the culmination of years and years of really trying to, and this is the first time that's been done in ecology, to my knowledge, taking multiple species and looking at the individual behavior and biology, and then explaining how those interactions lead to the geographical distributions that we see. So it's something I'm very excited about. But here's some different modeling that another one of my postdocs, Tim Newbold, has been doing. This is for tropical forests, and here this is, in terms of the model, is much simpler. It's a more sort of correlative statistical approach, but still done very rigorously, again, within a Bayesian context. And this is showing the projected impact of deforestation on 4 different groups of birds. Oh, sorry, this is the overall diversity of birds. And this is herbivorous birds. And the prediction here is that although deforestation reduces the diversity of bird species in the Amazon, in this case, in the Amazon region, and to a lesser extent in the seasonal dry forests here, the impact on herbivorous birds is very small, whereas the impact on frugivorous, so that's birds that eat fruits, and insects, birds that eat insects, insectivores, is much larger. So we're able to, by gathering lots and lots of data together and applying these methods, we're able to make predictions about how deforestation might affect bird biodiversity. And you heard from Tony Hay earlier about the impact of similar methods in other areas like medicine and so on. Right? Nowadays we can take large amounts of data and put them through Bayesian or other machine learning methods to make these kinds of predictions. But on a very different end of the spectrum, and actually this is work that Tim Newbold has also been involved in, along with 2 other postdocs, Mike Harfoot and Derek Tittensaw, we've tried to build, I'd say I'm going to be a bit stronger. We have built what we're calling a general ecosystem model. So this is certainly not a correlative model. This model actually tracks every individual organism, and I need to qualify that, everything multicellular. So even the very, very tiniest multicellular organisms, like the tiny rotifers and so on that you get in soil, and up, all of those individuals in an ecosystem. So typically, maybe 10 to the 13 individuals in a grid cell. And what happens is individuals go through processes like metabolism, so where we burn fuel, and they then go through processes like predation. So if you're a predator, you go and eat other things, and whatever kind of animal you are, there's always something trying to eat you. So we simulate things eating each other. And if you put on enough body mass, then you have spare mass to reproduce. So you make copies of yourself, so little copies of you, that then go on to metabolize and eat other things and develop. Things mutate and evolve in the model, so when you reproduce, the traits mutate. And finally, there's dispersal, so the individuals can move between grid cells. They're actually tracking every single organism within each grid cell, and when we simulate at the global scale, we're actually simulating every multicellular organism on Earth. Now, for those that are interested in computation, it won't surprise you that we don't actually simulate every single individual, because there are too many. But we use some computational tricks. So we group individuals into cohorts that are similar in their properties, and that way we can approximate that individual-based model. But the model is written for individuals, and that's just a computational step to then approximate the behavior of that whole model. And we had an article arguing for that approach recently in Nature. And you can actually run the model for one grid cell just on a laptop. I was going to do that in front of you, but it tends to lock up my laptop a bit. It's a bit old, this laptop, so but you can run it. And if anyone wants a copy, then once we publish the model, it will be open. And so if anyone wants to alter the model or play around with it, you'd be very welcome. There we go, live demo here. So here's some of the output that can emerge out of a model like that. This is what we call the trophic pyramid. Oh, let me see if I can do. Here we are. And so we end up with, this is the plant biomass, and then we have the herbivore biomass. That's animals that eat plants. Then we have omnivores, so animals that eat plants and other animals. And finally, carnivores that only eat other animals. And we can see this pyramid building up where we have more plants, and it goes down like this. And this is the transfer of energy between them. But I'd remind you that this is not the model. This is an aggregate view. This is an emergent property of the model. This is an aggregate view over it. This thing is emerging from the interactions between trillions of individuals. And things like the body size distribution. And then when we run it for the whole globe, we can look at correlations like this. So this is along here, I know there's no text, but it's the net primary productivity. So this is the rate that carbon goes into the ecosystem. And this is the equilibrium biomass of all animals combined. Blue is the ocean and green is on land. And then this is separating, again, according to herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. So we are able to, it's an interesting scientific challenge, obviously, to try to simulate every organism on Earth so we can explain how it is that the structure that we see in ecosystems emerges from those individual interactions. But also, we hope that it will be useful for understanding how we can look after the world's ecosystems better. So here's a simulation where we're allowing the model to settle down for a while, and then we hit it with a perturbation. And in this case, it's called HAMP. So this is when you starve the ecosystem from below, in effect. So you remove plant matter and you use it for human purposes. And therefore, there's less plant matter to feed the animals. And although you might not be able to see it here, if we look at the equilibrium biomass of animals against HAMP, there's what we call a tipping point, where up to about here, we have very little impact. So the system re-equilibrates given the HAMP, and we get a similar biomass of animals. But suddenly here, it drops off a cliff, and the ecosystem collapses. And it's those sorts of non-linear, non-intuitive patterns that you can get from this kind of process-based model that you tend not to get from the more correlative statistical models. And then here's one of these where we're combining two different pressures So along here we have this is the hamp again, the plants removed for human purposes. But up here we have harvesting of wild animals. So this is people going in and harvesting mammals, for example, from the ecosystem. And then the color scheme here is the proportion of simulations in which the ecosystem collapsed. And you can see that if we have harvesting of wild animals, then we can see an ecosystem collapse with much less hamp. So one form of pressure on the ecosystem makes it more sensitive to another form of pressure. Now that ecosystem model itself is actually fed by this carbon cycle model. So to spin up that whole ecosystem model, you need to simulate the dynamics of leaves and carbon, because that's what ultimately feeds the ecosystem. And that was another one of our major projects. This was by Matthew Smith in our group. And what we did was we defined a model for each location on Earth of how the carbon cycles through that place. So the carbon comes in from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, is then allocated to leaves, roots, and stems. Those three pools decay at a rate that goes, and they go down into the soil. And then in the soil, it goes through 2 or 3 different pools, fast and slow pools. I think someone was talking about the century model yesterday. So this is like a simplified version of the century model, and eventually makes it back into the atmosphere. But the point is that each of these rates, and there's fire involved, but each of these rates is dependent on the climate. And what we did was, instead of invent those rules, we got lots and lots of data about the carbon cycle from across the world, and we threw this exact model into our Filzbach tool. So this is our Metropolis Hastings sampler that some people saw yesterday. So you saw some very simple examples, but actually we just threw this thing into the same tool. And then we have the world's first fully data-constrained model of the terrestrial carbon cycle. So with that, we're able to use that to feed the Mattingly model, the GEM, the ecosystem model I showed you. But this is important in its own right too, because the behavior of the terrestrial carbon cycle is one of the largest sources of uncertainty in the future of the global climate. And so now, and the reason is that there are lots of models, but they haven't been constrained against data, and therefore they disagree. So we have this huge uncertainty about the carbon in the future. And now with a model like this, we can at least have a model that is constrained against data, so we can make rigorous predictions. And I also have a movie that Matthew made explaining that. And this is using Worldwide Telescope. And I know some people will have seen that before, but you also had a tutorial from Rob Fatland yesterday. And it's just here. I want to try this. Can anyone guess why I decided to put some Joni Mitchell music to go with the tour on this? I was wondering if it's the song Woodstock. That's right. So why would I pick that song for this? Can anyone get it right? Okay. Now the only thing is this is being videoed, right? So I'm a bit worried about the copyright on this song. So I've been really torn about, I'm still torn about whether I should instead sing the song, because I think if I sing it, I'm getting a rigorous head shake from Carol and not much reaction from anyone else. So I think that the opinion in the room is against me singing, which I'm quite relieved about, so we'll leave it. So also, Joni Mitchell's really hard to sing if you've ever tried. So I think we'll put it in, and if it has to be quiet, it does. But so there is obviously a more important point here, which is that we're able to, this is looking at the individual data sets, and then we'll see the model predictions in a minute. But there is a more important aspect to this, a serious aspect, which is, as we heard a little bit from Dan Fay yesterday too, as scientists, we tend to shy away from this kind of stuff because we think, why would I spend time working out how to do some groovy graphics and even think about the music to go with it, right? But especially now, you know, the world is really interested in ecology and environmental science, and if we want to reach out to them and explain our work, we might need to move outside the PDF article and to think quite radically about things like this. So things like this do have a potentially important role to play in the science as well. So it's not just a bit of fluff. But it is early in the morning, so I think you deserve... Did you hear that? The line is, "We are stardust, billion-year-old carbon." It was the only song I could think of that had carbon in it, you see. So she is amazing, isn't she? And it says, and the next lines go, "We are golden, but we're caught in the devil's bargain, and we have to get back to the garden." Okay. Good old Joni Mitchell. It was written a long time ago, but it's still true. So where are we? We are... Okay, and I've got some more work to show you. So what we've showed you so far has been about modeling the natural aspects of the world, right? So the carbon cycle, things that we are perturbing and affecting them. But it's important if we're going to make a joined-up decision about how we look after the world, that we also model human processes. So I've just got a couple of those. Well, this one's semi-human. So this is some work where we're starting to model global agricultural productivity and its potential response to climate change. I'm just looking at this in one of our tools here, so we'll do slice it by crop and scenario. And what we can look at then is, in this little tool, is the potential yield of wheat across the world and how that might change in a climate change scenario. So let's go. Crop 5 here is wheat. So you can see that when we run the model now, we capture the fact that wheat yields are highest in Europe, and then they're also high in China and Eastern North America, sorry. But what we're doing here is doing a 4-degree warming scenario, and you see that thing responding. And if we zoom in a little bit on somewhere like China, let's say, we should be able to see that. See, the red is a higher yield. So in this particular grid cell, for example, 5.2 tons a hectare, but under a 4-degree warming scenario, we're looking at something like 4.6. So we've lost about a fifth of the wheat yield according to that model. And so it's obvious that we need to think about that, because it's important to know whether we're going to be able to feed ourselves in the future. And two things are happening. Climate change is occurring. That's what this model addresses. It's also important to remember that every plant on Earth is experiencing a CO2 level that none of them have experienced in their recent evolutionary history. So we really don't know actually how plants will respond to high CO2. You may have seen the headlines that we've just gone over 400 parts per million for the first time in an incredibly long time. So we really need to work out actually whether we are going to be able to feed ourselves. But equally, agricultural productivity, or the lack of it, is the ultimate driver of land use change. It's one of the major drivers of land use change at global scales. So when we're thinking about simulating deforestation in a region like the Amazon, or African tropical forest, for example, then that rate is going to depend heavily on what's happening to agriculture. So, again, it's about moving a little bit outside the traditional focus that we would have in ecology and think we can study the natural ecosystems as much as we like, but if we really want to project the effect of human activities on the natural world, we have to think about all of these different aspects, including the human aspects. And as I'll show you in a bit, we're also modeling deforestation in the Amazon, for example. So I know that was a very long, it's kind of half of my talk, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for the variety of modeling exercises that we're doing. And of course, again, we're only one group among several in the world that are doing this kind of work. So in the rest of my talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it takes to do this kind of work. And especially, I think, where things need to go in terms of our overall approach to the science and the tools. And so I want to talk just a little bit about, say, actually, why do we need these models? I don't think that's going to take very long, so I'm going to skip through that. But then, more importantly, how can we build them? And how can we share and make use of models like this? And when we come to how can we build them, we're thinking about this pipeline here from data through models to predictions, actually back and forth. And this idea of open modeling, which I think there'll be several people here that have thought about open modeling, but it gets hardly any coverage compared, for instance, to open data, and yet it's at least as important. And how can we share and make use of them? And I want to show you a couple of our tools there, the FetchClimate 2 tool, and to talk a little bit about what I think of as defensible decision making. So the need for, I forgot to put my picture in, look, predictive model. This is very simple. I mean, to make any joined up decision about anything in life, we make predictions. And if you're buying a house, you would think about many different aspects. are going to inform that decision, all of which are about predicting about the future. And we do, but the reason you would not usually use quantitative modeling for that is probably because there are too many factors and they're too personal. But also we have very good instincts about most of those things. So you've got a good idea about whether you'd like a big house or a small house, or etc. But we don't have very good instincts about the behavior of ecosystems. They're too complex. They can do things like these tipping points. Of course, we already do predictive modeling for various other things that we have very bad instincts for, like aerodynamics, the global climate system, or the economy. So all we're calling for is to do that kind of predictive modeling for ecosystems to enable us to make a joined-up decision. But it's important, too, to realize that if models like this really are going to inform important decisions, like taxation policies, land use change policies, and so on, that those models can be defended. So here we've got a scientist defending his model. This is called the defense, this picture, I found it somewhere. So the idea is that, actually it's a very real possibility as a scientist that if you do build these models, you're going to have to defend them to people that matter. This is going to become much more common, I think, in the future. So how can we do that? How can we build these models and make them defensible? And this is what I call the defensible modeling pipeline. And the general idea here is that we have the models are really hypotheses about how the world works. They may not be the usual yes-no hypotheses that we're trained to think of in school, but they might be the mathematical laws that we think relate various things, but they're still ideas. And then on the other hand, we have data that pertains to the natural world too. And if we put these together appropriately in a Bayesian inference step, then what this gives us is two things. It gives us a refined idea about how the world works. So and this is the most important thing in the long term, is that we increase our understanding of the natural world. But at the same time, we get parameters for the model. So each of these mathematical objects comes with parameter values. And so we get a reduced set of objects with the parameters to go with it. And then this gives us, and with those two together, we can go and make our predictions with uncertainty. So in general, we know how we should be doing defensible modeling. And we can extend that picture a bit too to think about, well, once we have this, we can then feed back from these results to work out which data we should be collecting next. Which bits of data would have the greatest impact on our understanding and on the parameter values, and therefore on our available ability to predict. But while we're doing that, while we're improving the models and the science all the time, we need to be involved in a two-way dialogue with decision makers, some politicians here from Britain, who themselves need to be involved in a two-way dialogue with the citizens that put them in power. And the truth is, that's the messy world that we're in. And if we want to do work that's relevant, environmental work that's relevant, that's the way we need to think about it. So if we go through that pipeline, there are several technical challenges, I think, and I just thought I would just step through a few of those now. And I wanted to show one of them, which is a thing called FetchClimate. And again, I know some people saw this yesterday, but this is our attempt to take... So one of the main challenges is in doing environmental modeling, the models always depend on environmental factors like the climate, temperature, and precip, and so on. And so when we come to do that pipeline, we need to take whatever data we have and supplement it with environmental information. And that one step can be incredibly difficult and time-consuming again and again. So we've tried to build a tool to hugely accelerate that. I can show you here. And this is open now. It's called FetchClimate. So it's fetchclimate2.cloudapp.net. And it's an HTML5 tool. Well, actually, FetchClimate is really a back-end service that sits on the cloud, on Azure. And then one way to access it is through this UI here. So it's being a bit slow on the network, so we'll see how we do. That's the slowest I've seen it yet. I'm connected to the Wi-Fi, so... And that demo I showed you earlier was over the internet, so I'm definitely connected to Wi-Fi. Oh, here we go. So what we get is, the idea is we ask it what we want. So for example, we could have a look at air temperature. But then notice that we don't ask for a data set here. That's the traditional thing you see is it's a data set. I ask for actually the information that I really want, which is air temperature. And underneath here, you can see a set of data sets that in principle could fulfill queries about air temperature. But they're different. Some of them pertain to the past, some of them are predictions about the future, and some of them are climatology data sets. So these are things that are supposed to represent an average condition. And they have different spatial resolutions and different temporal resolutions and different error structures. And so what FetchClimate is going to do is, depending on the details of my query, it's going to choose the appropriate data set. And actually, the way it does that, it has a set of rules, so it eliminates some. It then runs the query on all remaining data sets, calculates the uncertainty, and returns the fetch with the lowest uncertainty. So it's doing, I like to think it's doing the kind of thing that a lab assistant would do. If you said, can you get me a grid of temperature for this particular place and time, they would make a judgment, and it's making those judgments for you. Although you can override those if you want. So then we choose a time horizon, so we could choose an average, let's say, over this period of years. This is, or we can step through the years, let's say in individual steps. Can you see that? So if we do that, we're going to get data that's indexed by year. Whereas under this option, it's going to just average over that period. Same through the year, so we can step through month by month, or we can average over the whole month, and same for hour of the day. So we can potentially do some quite complex fetches here, like we can get maybe a seasonal cycle for, so that is 12 monthly values for each year over 30 years, you see, things like that. Or a diurnal cycle for each day of the year, those sorts of things. And then we pick a region on the Earth somewhere. So given that I'm here, we may as well pick somewhere around Sao Paulo, which is somewhere in South. Oh, there we go. I knew it was here roughly. Here we are. So we put our grid there, and we say, and this is going to give us a 30 by 30 grid, but we could change that. And finally, we hit fetch, and all of that stuff's going to happen in the background. Now, the fetches can be a little bit slow because there's so much going on in the background. But let's say this thing, I would guess, would take 30 seconds or something. Obviously, that compares to not only how long it would have taken to do it normally, which would be a huge amount of time, but also chances are, if you did this the manual way, you would have compromised on something. Because if you had the data set that wasn't quite right, but there was another better data set, but you'd never downloaded it and never learned to use it, what are you going to do? You're going to use the one that's not quite right? Practice. So the idea is also the quality of the data this produces. Information should be better. But that's a bit slow, but we can come back to that later. So that's FetchClimate, and I encourage you to give it a go. That's at fetchclimate2.cloudapp.net. But we had a lot of time with FetchClimate yesterday, right, you guys? And and actually, I wonder if I've got, interestingly, because it does, FetchClimate does server-side caching. So if you do the same query, I wonder if this one here is going to work. All the query is included in the URL, and if you repeat the same query, it'll be very fast. So I wonder if this one's going to work. Let's see. There we go. That's nice. So this is one of the queries that we did yesterday. And because we did it yesterday, it was stored on the server. So when I just ran it again, because it was stored in my browser, it was very quick. And so we can just hover over there and have a look at how the precipitation varies across the country according to that particular fetch. Okay? And I imagine we've got some other ones in there. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Quite a few of them. What about... Is that the one we just did? Let's find out. Okay, and here, this is looking at a 10-year time slice for air temperature over central Brazil. Okay. So here we can look at how those temperatures vary through time, and if we hover the mouse, you should be able to see we can look at the time series. And you can do as many grids, as many points. You can make that a high-res grid, index them by year, by day of the year, or by hour of the day, as much as you want. So that's FetchClimate. So that's one of our technical challenges, is the idea that makes it very easy and quick to go and get the environmental data that you need to drive your models. So the next step, and this is something that I personally don't think our group has thought enough about. And I know there'll be some computer scientists here and some more general e-scientists. So it's something I would encourage you to think about and perhaps contribute to ecology, which is how we can best define models. The traditional way of defining a model is through a PDF article. And that's a really bad way, isn't it? Well, I mean, I guess it has its purposes. And so the normal way that I would use someone else's model is by reading a PDF article and then coding it again from scratch myself, which seems a bit inefficient, I think we would agree. But how else can we share models? Well, we could use generic imperative languages like C++. That's my kind of home. That's the one I'm most comfortable with. But I recognize the fact that that's not really a very good way to share models either. Reading C++ code doesn't really tell you often very obviously how the model really works. And a lot of the code will tend to be quite specific to the environment that you're running it in. We also have generic functional languages. This is some F#, which is what's in our distribution modeler tool. And I think that languages like this have a huge potential. Though computer scientists out there will realize the elegance and value of functional programming, which is it's a really incredible thing. And for the kind of work that we do, it's probably much better actually to use functional languages often than imperative languages. But nonetheless, these languages have still not really been designed for environmental modeling, let's say. They're very generic languages. On top of functional languages, or different languages, we can develop domain-specific languages. Here's an example from our sister group, which studies computational biology in Cambridge. So I have a colleague, Andrew Phillips, and he's developed several of these, and this is one called SPIM. And you can see in here that although it looks kind of similar to the F#, this has actually got some specific constructs for the domain that it works in. So if you look, there's RNA and DNA, and they're actually special words in that language. So this is a language that's been designed to specify a particular kind of model for a particular domain, in this case, interactions between genes. We can also have visual languages. This is an image from a language called Simile, which allows you to point and click and build a model just visually. But I think in the end, probably what we'd want is some combination of all of the above. And what that might be, I think, is hard to say. So I don't have anything to show you from our group for that. I just want to point out that it's a challenge. But on technical challenge 3, it's saying, right, so now you have your data and you've been able to specify your model somehow. Now you need to train the model to the data. And this is where the Bayesian inference comes in. And we talked about this yesterday in the tutorial. And the main thing I would stress again, is that it's becoming possible now to constrain much more complicated models to data using Bayesian inference. So at one time, you had to tailor the model to the problem so that you could train it efficiently in a computer. But it's now becoming possible to specify a model, an arbitrary model, of how you think the real world actually works. That model will tend to be mathematically and computationally inconvenient because the real world is inconvenient. But nonetheless, we can now fit those models to data just like we used to with the generic models. So I was having a chat earlier about someone doing species distribution modeling. And so this is modeling the relationship between the environment and species, presences or absences or abundances, biological species. And the models that are used in species distribution modeling at the moment are these more generic models that have been developed by computer scientists and statisticians, by and large, to be mathematically convenient. But nowadays, there's no reason why we couldn't do species distribution modeling, but where the model at the center is a much more ideas-rich representation of how we think the real world actually works, interactions between species and non-equilibrium and time lags and all sorts of things. So I just wanted to show you that here. We've got so one of the techniques that makes it possible to fit very complex models to data is called Metropolis Hastings MCMC sampling. This is the idea. You have your model and your data, and you do this sampling, and you get your parameters out. It's as simple as that. And also, I should say, if you have alternative models, then you're able to also compare different models, as well as parameterizing one model. So you can make a choice between things, and that way increase your understanding of how the real world works. So if we just zoom into this thing, This is a little sampler to help people understand. This is not really a working tool. But you can choose a model here, you can read about it, have a look at the code that would implement that model in C++. You can have a look at the data. So we've got some example data to have a look at. But then if we run, what happens is this method is very, very generic, and it goes on a random walk through parameter space. I know some people will know this already, but it goes on this walk, and it settles down to a distribution which is centered on the most likely parameter values, but then has a cloud of uncertainty around it. So we never just get the best parameter values. That's very important in the Bayesian world. We always get a spread of possibilities, and that's important because we're then going to propagate that spread of possibilities through the predictions so that our predictions have uncertainty on them, which is very important to decision makers. So if we go and run this thing, we can see it coming in from the cold. So it starts out here, but the best values are down here somewhere off the screen. And you can see that it's hunting out and it's finding the best parameter values. But then after a while, so the black points are the most recent so many points, it settles down on this kind of banana-y shape. And this thing here is what's called our posterior. Well, these are samples from the posterior probability distribution. So the most likely parameters for these two parameters is here, the most likely combination. But this represents the spread of uncertainty. Notice that spread is highly correlated and is nonlinear. Both of which mean that a lot of traditional methods would not be able to deal with that, but these methods are extremely robust. So that's kind of Filzbach in action, as it were. And there are other alternatives to Filzbach, I would stress. So this Filzbach is just one of several very generic MCMC samplers now. So traditionally, this kind of work required you to do a lot of clever hand tuning of the algorithm to make it work. But nowadays, we can just throw a model at it, and the thing can tune itself, and sort of an adaptive MCMC, as it's called. And Filzbach is one of those, but there are two others that we've tested that we're very impressed by. One is called STAN, and one is called ADMB. So I encourage everyone to have a look at all of those. So we've been able to get the data, specify a model, fit the model to the data to get parameters. So what do we get next? Let's have a look. Oh, that's right. I'll show you that I think we'll finish on that one. I just wanted to show you that, obviously, the things I showed you were in separate pieces. And so we're now trying to work on how we can join up the whole thing end to end. And we have a thing called Distribution Modeler, which we tried yesterday. And I think I'll finish on a quick demo of that. So I'll come back to that. So now we have the model parameterized. We can now go and take that and make a prediction. And that might be a prediction for a place that we've never visited before. So it might be finding potential places in a country that might be a reserve for a particular species, or it might be projecting the potential yield of wheat in a place where wheat has never been grown. That's one form of prediction, but another form of prediction is about the future, as I mentioned. So how can we share these models? And again, I think that this is only the first step, but I showed you FetchClimate 2 earlier. I just want to show you this, which is a version of FetchClimate 2 that we built for this conference, so we can have multiple copies of it. But in here, this doesn't just include data sets. So do you remember before, you might do a fetch for air temperature, and then it would find the data sets that could potentially fulfill that query about air temperature. Well, we've now made it possible to put in models that are driven by variables that are already in FetchClimate. So this model here, for example, or not that one, sorry, we want the one called pred soy, which would be here, pred soy, you see that? That's a simple model that predicts the yield of soybeans as a function of temperature and precip. So when we call that variable in FetchClimate, it does a two-step process. It looks at the model, and it sees that the model needs temperature and precip to run. We could do this. And so then it goes and does the fetch for temperature and precip, however we've asked it. So whatever grid, wherever in the world, whatever years, whatever days of the week, or whatever it is. It goes and gets that information, and it then runs that model to make predictions. and then you get the prediction back. So what this shows us is we can actually push models into these sorts of tools. So not model predictions, we're not actually taking the output of models and sharing them, we're actually sharing the models themselves so that they can be run on demand anywhere. So if we go over to Brazil, for example, we could do this. And that's what's happening there, why that spins. And again, it's hard to predict how long that might take. Now, that particular model is very simple. It's just a correlative model that relates temperature and precip, well, predicts the yield of soy from temperature and precip. But there's nothing in the system here or in general that would prevent us from using much more complicated models. So we could be spinning up, a very complex model here. Now, there are areas, of course, where that kind of thing already occurs, like the way we spin up hydrology models to predict floods in disaster situations and so on. And I hope that will come back. And hopefully the one we did earlier will also be there. There we go. There's the air temperature around Sao Paulo. Do you remember that fetch? So we'll come back to the soybean one in a bit. But also, if we look at some of the other things down here, we have bird species richness, for example. So these are things that pertain to this region. And we've got some deforestation predictions as well, which are... Where's that one? Maybe it's called predicted deforestation. Let's see. Just bear with me just a second, and then maybe I'm going to give up, because it's definitely there somewhere. I'm just missing it. Okay. Well, we could have the road density network instead. Okay. So this is now fetching. It can fetch multiple things at once, and you can go over them. So, here's the predicted soy yield then, which has come back. Can you see? So there's our a predicted pattern for the yield of soy then. And so, that model had never been run for 2012 on that grid before. It would just run on demand through the browser. And if we look at this is a prediction for the road density network in 2012 and the bird species richness, for example, for that region. Now, if we go and expand this fetch to go out to 2032, let's say, then again, that will take some time. But now we'll have each of those on a time series, and we'll have the predicted yield of soy for each year, 20 years into the future. You'd want to treat those with some caution, of course, but it will give you an idea of the potential year-to-year variation in soy yields. And we'll have a prediction for the development of the road network in the Amazon over the next 20 years. So in principle, you could imagine that going through this pipeline from data and models to predictions, and then actually sharing not just the predictions, but the models so that they can be run as and when they're needed, could be really quite transformative, because you can pretty much go through this end-to-end scenario now live, thanks to all of the clever technology that we have. Whereas still most of the decisions that decision makers have to make are made on PDF kind of articles, right? Someone runs a model, produces a scientific figure of some form, and it's a kind of dead object from then on, and it's typically out of date, and it may not be quite the view of the data that the decision maker needs. And we could completely transform that with this sort of end-to-end technology. And then just 2 or 3 final points. I showed you this video already. It's important to remember that what for us tends to be the end point of our work, making these model predictions available to decision makers, is the start of someone else's work. An important aspect that they're going to need to do is to tell a story about how they've made that decision and how the different model predictions have fed into that decision that they can share with the world. And finally, we shouldn't forget, of course, that all of this depended on having the data in the first place. And there is a huge shortage of truly ecological data. We hear about the data deluge, and it's true, actually, that we have had a transformation in ecologically relevant data, things like temperature and precip, or even things like the phenology of leaves, for example, recorded from satellites. All kinds of amazing things like that. But ecology is really the science of interactions among organisms. And we don't even have that many data on the presence or absence of organisms in different places, really. We're starting to get some, but not as many as you would think. And we have almost no data on interactions. I can't go onto the web, for instance, and find all known observations of a fox eating a rabbit. It's amazing. We just don't have, and yet that is actually the stuff that really drives ecological models. But with new technology, and I think a combination of new hardware, machine learning methods, but also social kind of crowdsourcing, we've got the potential to truly transform that and actually create, kind of orders of magnitude more information about the natural world, the presence or absence of different species, and even interactions among and behavior of organisms. So that's just a final point to say, you could get all of this pipeline in place, but ultimately you do need that data to make it all work. Now, I have 5 minutes, and I was going to show you our distribution modeler tool, but I'm a bit torn as to what to do. And I think I might not. If you do want to see it, there is a video on YouTube anyway. So if you search for distribution modeler, just spelled like distribution modeler, I guess I can do it here. I should be able to put some text on there, but I can't work out how to do it. So it's distribution modeler, spelt the English way, which is 2 L's. So distribution modeler. Then you can actually see the demo that I would have showed you. And I think it wouldn't be the best use of my time to give that demo here. So just to backtrack a bit then, we need to be able to make predictions about the natural world. To do that reliably, we're going to need to employ some quite sophisticated process-based models of how we think the real world works. But at the same time, we need to nest those process-based models within a pipeline, a rigorous pipeline that goes from data through Bayesian inference to parameters with uncertainty to predictions with uncertainty. And then we need to be able to share all of that with others. And if we're going to improve those models enough, we need to be able to share these models between us, challenge them, modify them, extend them, mutate them, and compete them against each other, and so on. And that's what we mean by open modeling. But I hope what I've shown you, and very much, I don't want to pretend that our group has it all down. We don't. We have a few prototypes for a few parts of the end-to-end challenge there. But in general, it would be possible to completely transform the way we do this sort of work. And I guess with that, and a lot of people in here most of you have got a long career ahead of you, and working together, we could completely transform the way we're able to predict the natural world, and therefore the way we're able to look after it. And with that, I'll just say thanks very much.